The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the polished floors of Balfour House as Vicksburg's elite swirled in their finest silks and wool dress coats, champagne flutes catching the amber glow of dozens of candles. But in the kitchen below, a young enslaved woman named Maria stirred something far more sinister than holiday punch into the evening's feast. This isn't just another tale of Christmas past. It's the story of how one person's desperate act of rebellion nearly wiped out an entire social circle in a single night, forever changing how we understand the hidden power dynamics of the antebellum South. December 24th, 1862. The address: 1002 Crawford Street, Vicksburg, Mississippi. Dr. William T. Balfour and his wife Emma had thrown open the doors of their grand mansion for what would become the most infamous Christmas Eve ball in the city's history. The guest list read like a who's who of Confederate Mississippi military officers whose brass buttons gleamed in the lamplight, plantation owners whose wealth was built on cotton and human bondage, and their wives adorned in jewelry that sparkled with the profits of enslaved labor. The Balfour House stood as a monument to Southern prosperity, its Greek Revival columns rising like sentinels above Crawford Street. Just 2 lots east, the Pemberton House would later serve as General John C. Pemberton's headquarters during the siege that would define Vicksburg's fate. But on this night, war felt distant. The sound of violin music drifted through rooms where imported wallpaper from France adorned the walls, and Persian rugs cushioned the footsteps of guests who had no idea they were dancing above a powder keg of resentment. In the basement kitchen, the real drama was unfolding. Maria moved between cast-iron pots and wooden preparation tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent her entire life in service to others. Her hands, scarred from years of burns and cuts, now wielded a different kind of power. The holiday menu she had prepared with meticulous care: roasted duck with cherry glaze, sweet potato soufflé, bourbon-laced pecan pie, would serve as the perfect delivery system for her revenge. The demographics of Vicksburg in 1860 told the story of a society built on human property. Of the roughly 4,591 residents counted in the census just 2 years earlier, approximately 1,400 were enslaved people like Maria. They were the invisible workforce that made evenings like this possible, the hands that prepared the food, polished the silver, and ensured every detail of Southern hospitality ran smoothly. Yet they remained nameless in most historical accounts, their stories buried beneath the grand narratives of their owners' lives. But Maria's story was about to explode into the light in the most dramatic way possible. Hey, before we dive deeper into this chilling tale, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into hidden history, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that uncover the truth behind the legends. What drove a young woman to risk everything in an act that would target not just her oppressor, but an entire room full of the South's most powerful people? The answer lies in understanding the suffocating world of bondage that defined every moment of her existence, and the specific events that pushed her past the breaking point. But first, we need to understand exactly who was in that room that night and why their deaths would have sent shockwaves through the entire Confederacy. Brigadier General Martin Luther Smith adjusted his gold-braided uniform as he stepped through the mahogany doors of Balfour House, his boots clicking against marble that had been polished to mirror perfection by hands he would never bother to acknowledge. Behind him, Lieutenant General Stephen D. Lee followed, their combined military authority representing the backbone of Confederate resistance in the Mississippi River Valley. The guest list that night wasn't just a social gathering. It was a war council disguised as a Christmas celebration, and Maria was about to serve them their last supper. Dr. Balfour had spared no expense in assembling what amounted to a shadow government of the Confederacy's Western Front. Smith, the chief engineer responsible for Vicksburg's fortifications, carried in his head the defensive plans that kept Union forces at bay. Lee, barely 30 years old, but already commanding thousands of Confederate troops, represented the new generation of Southern military leadership. Their presence at the ball signaled that this wasn't merely a holiday party, it was a gathering of the men who held the fate of the Mississippi River, and perhaps the entire Confederacy, in their hands. The parlor buzzed with conversations that would have fascinated Union spies. Cotton futures, troop movements, supply line logistics, all discussed over crystal glasses filled with imported French wine. The women, resplendent in silk gowns that cost more than most families earned in a year, fanned themselves delicately while discussing the inconveniences of wartime shortages. Mrs. Emma Balfour, the evening's hostess, moved gracefully between groups, her emerald necklace catching the light as she ensured every guest felt properly honored. But beneath the polished veneer of Southern hospitality, tensions simmered. The Union blockade was tightening its grip on Confederate supply lines. Vicksburg, perched on its high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi, had become the cork in the bottle of Union strategy. If the city fell, the Confederacy would be split in two, its western states cut off from Virginia and the Carolinas. Every person in that room understood the stakes, even as they sipped champagne and discussed the latest fashions from New Orleans. In the kitchen below, Maria understood the stakes too, but from a vastly different perspective. She had listened to enough dinner conversations to know that these people viewed her and others like her as property to be bought, sold, and worked until death. The very wealth that paid for tonight's lavish spread had been built on the backs of people who looked like her, who shared her circumstances, who had no voice in determining their own fate. The guest list also included several of Vicksburg's wealthiest plantation owners, men whose vast cotton estates stretched for miles along the Mississippi Delta. Their conversations that evening would have revealed the intricate web of relationships that bound together the Confederate elite business partnerships, built on enslaved labor, political alliances forged through shared economic interests, and social bonds that reinforced a system designed to maintain their power at any cost. What made this gathering particularly significant was its timing. Christmas Eve, 1862, marked a pivotal moment in the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation was set to take effect in just 1 week, on January 1st, 1863. While it wouldn't immediately free enslaved people in Confederate-held territory like Mississippi, its symbolic power was enormous. The guests at Balfour House were gathering not just to celebrate the holiday, but to steel themselves for what many suspected would be their final season of unchallenged dominance. The menu itself told a story of conspicuous consumption in wartime. Despite the Union blockade that had made luxury goods increasingly scarce, the Balfours had somehow managed to procure delicacies that most Confederates could only dream of. Oysters shipped inland from the Gulf Coast, wine that had somehow slipped through Union naval patrols, sugar that was worth its weight in silver. Each dish represented not just wealth, but defiance, a message that the Confederate elite would maintain their lifestyle no matter the cost. Maria had prepared every bite with her own hands. She had shucked those oysters, her fingers growing numb in the cold water. She had stirred the heavy cream sauces until her arm ached, seasoned the roasts with herbs she had grown in the kitchen garden, and carefully plated each course with an artist's attention to detail. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who owned nothing, not even herself, was creating a feast that would showcase her master's wealth to their peers. But as she worked, Maria had made a decision that would transform her from invisible servant to history's most devastating dinner guest. The same hands that had prepared countless meals for the Balfour family, that had nursed their children through fevers and cleaned their wounds, would now serve as instruments of a justice that the legal system would never provide. The poison she had chosen was both accessible and nearly undetectable when properly prepared. In an era before modern forensic science, When sudden deaths were often attributed to everything from bad humors to divine judgment, a skilled cook could easily mask the bitter taste of certain toxins with the rich flavors and strong spices that define Southern cuisine. What none of the guests swirling through the Balfour House parlors could have imagined was that their host's kitchen had become a laboratory for revolution, and that their trusted cook had just transformed from servant to executioner. But how had Maria acquired the knowledge and materials for such an elaborate plot? And what specific grievances had driven her to risk everything in a single devastating act of rebellion? Maria's calloused fingers traced the rim of the ceramic jar hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the servants' quarters, its contents more dangerous than any Confederate artillery shell currently aimed at Union gunboats on the Mississippi River. Inside lay enough white arsenic powder to fell a cavalry regiment if one knew how to use it properly. Understanding Maria's transformation from kitchen servant to mass poisoner requires us to examine the brutal education system that slavery imposed on its victims, where survival often meant learning skills that masters never intended to teach. Maria hadn't been born at Balfour House. Like many enslaved people in Vicksburg, she had been sold away from her family as a child, arriving in Mississippi from a tobacco plantation in Virginia, where her grandmother had served as both cook and unofficial healer. It was this grandmother who had first taught Maria the deadly secret that herbs and spices could heal or kill. Every root that soothes a fever can stop a heart, the old woman had whispered during late-night lessons in the slave quarters. If you know the measure. The knowledge had been passed down through generations of women who understood that in a world where they had no legal protections, sometimes the only power lay in understanding which plants could provide a final escape from unbearable circumstances. What began as traditional folk medicine treating dysentery with roots, easing childbirth pain with carefully brewed teas, gradually evolved into something more dangerous in the hands of people who had nothing left to lose. Dr. Balfour, ironically, had unknowingly provided Maria with her most deadly education. As Vicksburg's most prominent physician, he maintained an extensive medical library in his study, books that detailed everything from anatomy to pharmacology. During the long afternoons when she cleaned his office, Maria had taught herself to read using those very texts, memorizing the effects of various compounds on the human body. The same medical knowledge that Dr. Balfour used to heal his wealthy white patients became the foundation for Maria's understanding of how to kill them. The arsenic itself had come from the house's own supply. In 1862, arsenic was as common in Southern households as flour or sugar. It served as rat poison in the cellars, as a component in certain medicines, and even as an ingredient in some cosmetics that promised to give ladies the fashionably pale complexion that marked them as too refined for outdoor labor. Maria had been gradually collecting small amounts over months, scraping powder from the corners of containers, salvaging remnants that would never be missed. But arsenic alone wouldn't have been enough for Maria's ambitious plan. The research notes from Mississippi's legal archives reveal a similar case from just 5 years earlier, the trial of Josephine versus the state, where an enslaved cook had been caught attempting to poison her owner's tea with arsenic. The forensic evidence in that case, analyzed by chemist W.D. Moore, showed octahedral arsenical crystals in the teapot residue. Josephine's mistake had been using too much poison in too small a serving, making the bitter metallic taste immediately obvious to her intended victims. Maria had learned from Josephine's failure. Instead of concentrating the poison in a single dish, she planned to distribute smaller, undetectable amounts across multiple courses. The rich flavors of Christmas cuisine, the molasses in the ham glaze, the strong spices in the plum pudding, the bourbon in the eggnog, would mask any bitter aftertaste. More importantly, the symptoms wouldn't appear immediately, allowing her to serve every course before anyone realized what was happening. The timing of her plan wasn't accidental. Christmas Eve of 1862 represented more than just a holiday celebration. It marked what many Confederates feared might be their last Christmas before Union forces captured Vicksburg and ended their way of life forever. The Emancipation Proclamation, set to take effect in just 8 days, hung over the evening like a storm cloud. For the white elite gathered in the Balfour parlor, it represented the end of their world. For Maria, it represented the possibility of freedom if she could live long enough to see it. Her personal motivation ran deeper than political ideology. 3 months earlier, Dr. Percent, Balfour had sold Maria's 7-year-old son Thomas to a cotton plantation in Louisiana to settle a gambling debt. The boy had been ripped from her arms on a Tuesday morning in September, loaded onto a wagon with 6 other children, and driven away while Maria was forbidden from even saying goodbye. The memory of his screams still echoed in her dreams, and every night she went to sleep knowing she would likely never see him again. This wasn't unusual. Enslaved families were regularly torn apart by the economic whims of their owners. Children sold to pay debts, spouses separated when estates changed hands, parents never knowing if their offspring would live or die hundreds of miles away. The psychological torture of this system was perhaps even more devastating than the physical brutality, creating wounds that never healed and anger that simmered for lifetimes. Maria had spent the weeks following her son's sale in a haze of grief and rage. But gradually, as she continued to serve meals to the very people who had enabled his sale, a cold calculation had replaced her raw emotion. If she was going to strike back, it would be thorough, methodical, and devastating. She wouldn't just target Dr. Balfour, she would target the entire network of power that had made her son's sale possible. The menu for Christmas Eve had been planned for weeks, each dish carefully selected not just for flavor, but for its ability to conceal her additions. The cream-based sauces would hide the texture of any foreign substances. The heavily spiced dishes would mask unusual tastes. The multiple courses would ensure that even if someone noticed something amiss with one dish, they would have already consumed enough from previous courses to seal their fate. As the clock in the Balfour House foyer chimed 9 o'clock that Christmas Eve, Maria made her final preparations in the kitchen. The first course, a delicate turtle soup that had taken her 3 days to prepare, was ready to serve. The arsenic had been stirred in so thoroughly that even she couldn't detect its presence. In just minutes, she would begin serving what she intended to be the last meal these people would ever enjoy. But Maria had no way of knowing that her carefully orchestrated plan was about to be interrupted by events far beyond her control. Events that would arrive not from her kitchen, but from the dark waters of the Mississippi River itself. What was racing toward Vicksburg through the cold December night that would transform Maria's private war into something far more complex and dangerous? Maria's silver ladle trembled imperceptibly as she filled the first bowl of turtle soup, the rich brown broth swirling with flecks of sherry and cream that perfectly concealed the colorless powder she had stirred in just moments before. Above her, the sounds of laughter and conversation filtered through the floorboards as Vicksburg's most powerful citizens prepared to consume their own destruction. This was the moment when theory became reality, when months of careful planning would either succeed in spectacular fashion or fail with equally spectacular consequences for Maria herself. The serving process began at exactly 9:45 that evening. Maria had trained the other kitchen staff to follow her lead, without question, a hierarchy within the enslaved community that mirrored the rigid social structures of the white world above. 2 younger women, Sarah and Ruth, carried the soup bowls upstairs on silver platters, while Maria remained in the kitchen, her heart pounding as she ladled poison into bowl after bowl with the mechanical precision of someone who had served hundreds of meals in this very room. Dr. Balfour raised his spoon first, as was his custom as host. The turtle soup was a particular favorite of his. Maria had served it to him dozens of times before, and she knew exactly how he liked it seasoned. Tonight, She had added one extra ingredient that he would never taste. The rich, complex flavors of the soup, enhanced with a generous splash of cream sherry and seasoned with white pepper and fresh thyme, completely masked the metallic undertone that might have betrayed the arsenic's presence. Across the dining room, General Smith complimented Mrs. Balfour on the exceptional quality of the soup, noting how the turtle meat had been prepared to perfect tenderness. His words carried to the kitchen through the serving door, where Maria listened with grim satisfaction. If she had calculated correctly, the general had just consumed enough arsenic to kill a horse, though the symptoms wouldn't begin for at least 30 minutes. The second course followed seamlessly roasted duck with cherry glaze, accompanied by cornbread dressing and sweet potato soufflé. Maria had been even more creative with this course, incorporating the poison into the glaze itself. The natural tartness of the cherries, combined with brown sugar and bourbon, created a flavor profile so complex that no one would detect the slight bitterness that arsenic might otherwise impart. She watched through the kitchen doorway as General Lee cut into his duck, the dark meat glistening with its deadly coating. By 10:30, Maria had served 3 full courses to 20 guests, each portion carefully dosed to ensure maximum effect while maintaining the elegant presentation that the Balfour family expected. The conversations upstairs had grown more animated as the wine flowed freely, another element of Maria's plan. Alcohol would accelerate the absorption of the poison into their bloodstreams, while also making them less likely to notice any subtle changes in how they felt. The first sign that something was amiss came at 11:15, when Mrs. Charlotte Pemberton, wife of the future general, whose house stood just 2 lots away, excused herself from the table, claiming sudden nausea. Maria, who had been preparing the dessert course in the kitchen, felt a surge of both satisfaction and terror. It was beginning. Within minutes, 2 more guests complained of stomach distress. Dr. Say, Balfour, drawing on his medical training, initially attributed the symptoms to overindulgence. Rich food and strong drink often had such effects at elaborate dinner parties. But as more guests began to feel unwell, a subtle panic began to ripple through the gathering. Maria continued with her preparations for the final course bourbon pecan pie with whipped cream, knowing that she had already achieved her primary objective. Even if no one ate dessert, the damage was done. The poison was now coursing through the bloodstreams of 20 of the Confederacy's most important figures. In a matter of hours, they would all be dead, and the power structure that had enabled her son's sale would suffer a devastating blow. But at 12:07 in the morning, just as Maria was putting the finishing touches on the dessert presentation, the front door of Balfour House burst open with a sound like thunder. A figure stumbled into the foyer, his clothes soaked with river water, and his face pale with exhaustion and terror. Philip H. Fall, a Confederate courier, had just completed a harrowing journey across the storm-lashed Mississippi River with news that would change everything. "This ball is at an end," he gasped, his voice carrying clearly into the dining room, where the poisoned guests were beginning to realize that their illness was more than simple overindulgence. "The enemy are coming down the river. All non-combatants must leave the city." The timing of Fall's arrival couldn't have been more catastrophic for Maria's carefully orchestrated plan. Instead of remaining in place to suffer the full effects of the poison, the guests began a frantic exodus from Balfour House, scattering into the December night just as the toxin was beginning to take hold. Her perfect crime was being undone by forces completely beyond her control. What had driven this courier to risk his life crossing a storm-swept river in the middle of the night? And how would his warning ultimately determine whether Maria's victims lived or died? 36 miles upriver at Lake Providence, Major Lee L. Daniels had been hunched over his telegraph key in a cramped office that reeked of tobacco smoke and lamp oil, his fingers flying across the brass contacts as he tapped out the most urgent message of his military career. Through the storm-lashed windows, he could see the impossible sight that had sent him racing to his equipment. 59 transport ships and 7 gunboats cutting through the churning waters like harbingers of apocalypse. This message would travel faster than any horse or boat, racing along copper wires to save a city that was about to be caught completely unprepared. But it would also save the lives of people who had no idea they were already dying. The transmission had taken exactly 27 seconds to send from Daniels's office, located roughly 3 miles inland from the river. His message was stark and terrifying. 7 gunboats and 59 transports passing Lake Providence southbound. Estimate arrival, Vicksburg before dawn. Prepare for immediate attack. The Union fleet that Daniels had spotted represented the largest amphibious assault force ever assembled on the Mississippi River, carrying enough troops and artillery to reduce Vicksburg to rubble. Philip H. Fall had received that telegraph message at 11:35 and immediately understood that getting the warning to Vicksburg's military leadership was worth any risk. The roads were impassable due to winter flooding, and horses couldn't cover the distance fast enough. His only option was the river itself, the same treacherous waterway that was currently carrying a Union invasion fleet toward his city. Fall's journey across the storm-swept Mississippi had been a nightmare of near misses and desperate improvisation. Using a small skiff that was barely seaworthy in calm conditions, he had navigated by the light of a red lantern, signaling friendly Confederate batteries along the shore to avoid being shot by his own forces. The December storm had lashed him with freezing rain and wind gusts that threatened to capsize his tiny boat every few minutes. Twice he had nearly collided with debris swept downstream by the flooding river. But back at Balfour House, his dramatic arrival had triggered exactly the kind of chaos that Maria had never anticipated. The poisoned guests, already beginning to feel the first subtle effects of arsenic poisoning, slight nausea, a metallic taste in their mouths, the beginning whispers of abdominal discomfort, suddenly found themselves caught between 2 different kinds of death. General Smith was the first to grasp the military implications of Fall's warning. Despite the growing queasiness that he attributed to rich food and wine, he immediately began organizing the evacuation of non-combatants and the mobilization of Vicksburg's defenses. His mind, still sharp despite the poison beginning to circulate through his system, calculated distances and timing. If the Union fleet had passed Lake Providence when Daniels sent his message, they would reach Vicksburg's outer defenses within hours. The ballroom erupted into controlled pandemonium. Ladies grabbed their shawls and jewelry, while their husbands shouted orders to servants and discussed defensive positions. Carriages were summoned, horses were hastily saddled, and within minutes the carefully orchestrated social gathering had transformed into a military emergency evacuation. The irony was bitter. Maria's victims were fleeing to save their lives, just as her poison was beginning to work. Dr. Balfour, his medical instincts overriding his social obligations, began checking on guests who were complaining of illness. Several of the women had developed obvious distress, pale complexions, cold sweats, and the kind of stomach cramping that couldn't be explained by nervousness alone. But with a Union invasion fleet bearing down on the city, he had no time for thorough examinations. His priority was getting his family and friends to safety. Maria watched from the kitchen doorway as her targets scattered into the December night. Mrs. N. Pemberton, who should have been writhing in agony within the hour, was instead climbing into a carriage bound for the countryside. General Lee, whose military genius Maria had hoped to erase forever, was already mounting his horse to ride toward the Confederate defensive positions. One by one, the people she had poisoned were escaping not just her justice, but potentially the effects of her carefully calculated doses. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent months planning the perfect murder, only to have it interrupted by a war that she had played no part in starting. The same conflict that had torn her son away from her was now saving the lives of the people she had meant to kill. It was as if the entire universe was conspiring to protect the very system that had destroyed her family. Yet as she watched the evacuation unfold, Maria began to notice that not everyone was recovering from their illness. 3 of the older guests, plantation owners whose advanced age made them more susceptible to poison, were struggling to maintain their composure, even as they prepared to flee. Their faces had taken on a grayish pallor that went beyond simple nausea, and their movements had become unsteady in a way that suggested something more serious than indigestion. The storm outside intensified as the last of the guests departed Balfour House, leaving behind overturned wine glasses, half-eaten plates of food, and the lingering scent of expensive perfume mixed with something else, the faint, acrid smell of fear. Maria stood alone in the kitchen that had been her laboratory, surrounded by the evidence of both her crime and its interruption. But the night's drama was far from over. As the poisoned elite of Vicksburg fled into the darkness, some carrying more deadly cargo in their bloodstreams than they realized, Maria would soon discover that her actions had set in motion a chain of events that would intersect with the Union invasion in ways that no one could have predicted. What would happen when the effects of the poison finally caught up with Confederate military leaders just as they were needed most to defend their city? General Martin Luther Smith collapsed against the earthen walls of Battery de Gaulier at exactly 4:27 in the morning, his uniform soaked with sweat despite the December cold, as waves of agony tore through his abdomen like cannon fire. Around him, Confederate soldiers scrambled to position artillery pieces for the impending Union assault, unaware that their commanding officer was fighting a battle far more personal and deadly than anything approaching on the Mississippi River. This wasn't just military history unfolding. It was the moment when Maria's interrupted revenge began to catch up with its targets, threatening to cripple Vicksburg's defenses at the precise instant when the city needed them most. The poison had been working its way through Smith's system for over 6 hours, and the general's body was finally succumbing to the massive dose of arsenic that Maria had stirred into his turtle soup. What had begun as mild nausea during the evacuation from Balfour House had progressed through increasingly severe stomach cramping, violent diarrhea, and now the distinctive burning sensation in his throat that marked advanced arsenic poisoning. Smith wasn't alone in his suffering. 3 miles south, at the Stockade Redan fortification, Lieutenant General Stephen D. Lee was experiencing similar symptoms, though his younger constitution was fighting the poison more effectively. Lee had managed to maintain command of his artillery batteries, but his staff officers had noticed his unusual pallor and the tremor in his hands as he studied defensive maps by lamplight. The timing couldn't have been more catastrophic for Confederate defenses. Major Daniels's telegraph warning had proven accurate. Union gunboats were already visible on the river, their dark silhouettes cutting through the pre-dawn mist like mechanical sea monsters. Admiral David Porter's fleet had covered the distance from Lake Providence faster than anyone had anticipated, and Vicksburg's hastily assembled defenses were about to face their first major test. Dr. Balfour, despite his own increasing illness, had established a makeshift medical station in the basement of his own house. 3 of his former dinner guests had already been carried in by their families' elderly plantation owners, whose advanced age had made them particularly vulnerable to Maria's poison. 1, a cotton broker named Harrison Wells, who owned over 200 enslaved people, was already showing signs of organ failure. His skin had taken on the distinctive grayish-blue tinge that indicated his liver was shutting down. The medical challenges were complicated by the fact that arsenic poisoning in 1862 was poorly understood and virtually impossible to treat. Dr. Balfour had his suspicions about the cause of the widespread illness. Too many of his dinner guests were experiencing identical symptoms for this to be coincidence, but he lacked both the time and the diagnostic tools to confirm his file. Fears. With Union artillery about to rain down on his city, treating mysterious poisoning cases had to take second priority to preparing for mass casualties from the coming bombardment. Meanwhile, back at Balfour House, Maria had discovered that her night of revenge was far from over. Sarah, one of the younger kitchen servants who had helped serve the poisoned meal, had made a disturbing discovery while cleaning the dining room. Several of the guests, in their haste to evacuate, had left behind personal items, jewelry, calling cards, even a military dispatch case that General Smith had dropped during his hurried departure. But more significantly, Sarah had found something that chilled Maria to her core: a half-eaten plate of turtle soup that Mrs. Emma Balfour had abandoned when the evacuation began. The soup contained the same deadly arsenic that Maria had stirred into every other bowl, but this particular serving had been intended for the hostess herself, a woman who had always treated Maria with what passed for kindness in the brutal hierarchy of slavery. The realization hit Maria like a physical blow. In her rage over her son's sale, in her determination to strike back at the entire system that had destroyed her family, she had targeted everyone equally. She hadn't distinguished between Dr. Balfour, who had sold her child, and his wife, who had never participated directly in that transaction. Her poison had been democratically distributed, condemning the guilty and innocent alike. As dawn broke over Vicksburg, the first Union artillery shells began screaming overhead, their explosive impacts shaking the ground and rattling windows throughout the city. But for Maria, the external war paled in comparison to the internal conflict that was now tearing her apart. She had achieved exactly what she had set out to do. Several of her targets were dying. The Confederate military leadership was crippled at a crucial moment, and the social order that had enabled her son's sale was facing its greatest crisis. Yet victory felt nothing like she had imagined. Instead of satisfaction, she felt only a growing horror at what she had unleashed. The sounds of battle, mixed with reports filtering back from the makeshift hospitals throughout the city, reports of agonizing deaths, of military officers collapsing at their posts, of families destroyed not by Union bullets, but by poison served at their own Christmas table. The ultimate irony was becoming clear. Maria had sought to strike a blow for freedom by destroying the Confederate elite, but her actions were now weakening the very defenses that might have protected the enslaved population of Vicksburg from whatever fate awaited them under Union occupation. She had no way of knowing whether federal forces would bring liberation or simply a different form of oppression. As the morning wore on and the artillery barrage intensified, messengers began arriving with increasingly desperate reports from the Confederate defensive positions. General Smith was unable to maintain command due to severe illness. Several battery commanders had collapsed and been replaced by junior officers. The carefully coordinated defense plan that had taken months to develop was falling apart just as it was needed most. But perhaps the most chilling report came from Dr. Balfour's makeshift hospital. 3 of Maria's victims had now died, their final hours marked by the excruciating symptoms of arsenic poisoning, convulsions, respiratory failure, and the kind of agony that no amount of laudanum could ease. Their deaths would soon be discovered by investigators, who would begin asking questions that Maria was not prepared to answer. How long could she maintain her silence when the evidence of her crime was mounting with each death? And what would happen when the authorities realized that Vicksburg's military collapse had been caused not by Union strategy, but by poison served at a Christmas dinner? Dr. William Balfour's hands trembled as he lifted the delicate china teacup to examine its contents under the flickering lamplight of his study, the bitter almond scent rising from the residue, confirming his worst fears about what had really happened at his Christmas Eve dinner party. Outside, Union artillery continued to pound Vicksburg's defenses, but inside his house, a different kind of war was being waged, one that would determine whether Maria's secret died with her victims or exploded into a scandal that would shake the foundations of Confederate Mississippi. This moment marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of Maria's gamble, when suspicion would either fall elsewhere or focus with deadly precision on the one person who had access to every dish served that night. The doctor's investigation had begun out of pure medical necessity. With 4 of his dinner guests now dead and 7 others critically ill with identical symptoms, he couldn't ignore the possibility that something beyond coincidence was at work. The pattern was too clear, too consistent across victims of different ages and health conditions. They had all eaten the same food, drunk from the same bottles, and shared the same terrible fate. Balfour's medical training had provided him with knowledge that most physicians in 1862 lacked familiarity with toxicology texts that described the precise symptoms of various poisons. The progression he was witnessing matched almost perfectly with the case studies of arsenic poisoning that he had read in European medical journals. The initial gastrointestinal distress, followed by the distinctive metallic taste, the burning throat, and finally the cardiovascular collapse that had claimed his guests' lives. But understanding what had happened was only the first step. Proving it would require evidence, and evidence would inevitably lead to questions about who had the opportunity and motive to poison an entire dinner party. In the rigidly hierarchical world of the antebellum South, suspicion would naturally fall on the enslaved people who had prepared and served the meal. Maria knew that her time was running out. From her position in the kitchen, she could hear Dr. Balfour moving through the house, collecting plates, glasses, and serving dishes for examination. She had cleaned most of the evidence of her crime, but arsenic was notoriously persistent. Traces would remain in the cookware, the serving utensils, even the wooden cutting boards where she had prepared ingredients. The investigation took on added urgency because of its timing. With Union forces literally at Vicksburg's gates, the Confederate military couldn't afford to lose any more officers to mysterious illness. General Smith remained incapacitated, his command transferred to a junior officer who lacked his experience with the city's defensive positions. General Lee was still functional, but operating at reduced capacity, his decision-making impaired by the ongoing effects of arsenic poisoning. Word of the suspicious deaths had already reached Confederate military intelligence, where investigators were considering the possibility of Union sabotage. The timing seemed too convenient to be accidental. A dinner party filled with key military and civilian leaders struck down just as the city faced its greatest threat. Federal agents operating behind enemy lines could theoretically have orchestrated such an attack, making it a matter of military security as well as civilian law enforcement. But Maria had advantages that outside saboteurs wouldn't possess. She knew the routines of the Balfour household intimately, understood which family members preferred which dishes, and could predict with accuracy how much each guest would consume. More importantly, she had been serving meals to these same people for years without incident, establishing a pattern of trust that made her an unlikely suspect in the minds of investigators who were looking for enemy agents or disgruntled outsiders. The breakthrough in Dr. Balfour's investigation came when he examined the turtle soup tureen that had been left in the kitchen overnight. Using a simple chemical test that involved adding sulfur compounds to the remaining liquid, he was able to detect the distinctive yellow precipitate that indicated the presence of arsenic. The soup the first course served that evening had been deliberately contaminated with enough poison to kill everyone who consumed it. This discovery transformed the investigation from a medical mystery into a criminal matter of the highest order. Dr. Unquote Balfour immediately summoned the local magistrate, despite the ongoing artillery bombardment that made travel through the city extremely dangerous. The implications were staggering. Someone with access to his kitchen had attempted to assassinate virtually every person of importance in Vicksburg on the same night that Union forces launched their assault. The magistrate, Judge Harrison Blackwood, arrived at Balfour House just after noon on Christmas Day. A thin, severe man in his 60s who had built his career prosecuting crimes involving enslaved people, he brought with him the full authority of Confederate law and a reputation for extracting confessions through whatever means necessary. His presence in the house sent a chill through the remaining servants, who understood that their very survival now depended on convincing him of their innocence. Maria had spent the morning destroying what evidence she could and preparing for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation. She had disposed of the remaining arsenic, scrubbed every surface in the kitchen with lye soap, and rehearse the story she would tell if questioned. But she knew that her knowledge of the crime's details would either save her or condemn her, depending on how cleverly she could present herself as a loyal servant rather than a vengeful saboteur. The first phase of Judge Blackwood's investigation involved interviewing each member of the household staff separately, looking for inconsistencies in their stories and signs of guilt or knowledge about the poisoning. The other servants, Sarah, Ruth, and the elderly groundskeeper named Moses, were questioned first, their testimonies establishing the timeline of food preparation and service throughout Christmas Eve. When Maria's turn came, she found herself facing a man whose pale blue eyes seemed to look right through her pretenses to the anger and calculation beneath. Judge Blackwood had prosecuted dozens of cases involving enslaved people accused of crimes against their owners, and he understood the psychology of rebellion better than Maria had anticipated. His questions were precise, probing, designed to catch her in contradictions or reveal knowledge that an innocent servant shouldn't possess. "You prepared every dish served that evening," he stated, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You had access to all the ingredients, all the cookware, all the serving pieces. If someone poisoned my guests, Maria, that someone would have needed exactly the access that you possessed." The moment had arrived when Maria's carefully constructed facade would either hold or crumble, determining not just her own fate, but potentially revealing the full scope of her crime and the motivations that had driven her to risk everything in a single night of revenge. But as Judge Blackwood prepared to intensify his interrogation, both he and Maria were about to discover that the truth about what happened at Balfour House was far more complex and far more uncertain than either of them had imagined. Judge Blackwood's weathered finger traced the rim of the evidence cup one final time before setting it down on Dr. H.T. Balfour's mahogany desk, his decision already made, despite the artillery shells still screaming overhead and the smoke rising from Vicksburg's burning waterfront. In his 30 years of prosecuting enslaved people accused of crimes against their masters, he had learned to distinguish between guilt and innocence with what he believed was infallible accuracy. But Maria's case would prove to be his most haunting mistake. This final confrontation would determine not just one woman's fate, but how history would remember the night when Vicksburg's elite nearly fell to poison instead of Union bullets. The interrogation had stretched through most of Christmas Day, with Maria maintaining her composure even as Judge Blackwood employed increasingly aggressive tactics. She had answered every question with the careful deference expected of an enslaved servant, expressing shock and horror at the suggestion that anyone in Dr. Remembered Balfour's household could be capable of such a crime. Her performance was flawless, too flawless, in the judge's opinion. "You show remarkable composure for someone whose employers have just been murdered," Blackwood observed, his pale eyes studying Maria's face for any crack in her facade. Most innocent servants would be weeping, terrified they might be blamed for something they didn't do. Yet you sit there calm as Sunday morning, answering my questions like you've rehearsed them. Maria had indeed rehearsed her responses, but not in the way the judge imagined. Every word she spoke was calculated to present herself as exactly what she appeared to be, a loyal cook who had served the Balfour family faithfully for years. She expressed appropriate grief for the victims, proper concern for Dr. Balfour's health, and complete bewilderment about how such a tragedy could have occurred in a house she knew so intimately. But as the afternoon wore on, Judge Blackwood began to encounter a problem that would ultimately save Maria's life. The evidence was disappearing. The Union bombardment of Vicksburg had intensified throughout the day, with several artillery shells landing dangerously close to Balfour House. More critically, Dr. Rumand, Balfour himself, was showing increasing signs of arsenic poisoning, his condition deteriorating rapidly as the toxin continued to circulate through his system. By evening, it became clear that Dr. Balfour might not survive to testify about his chemical analysis of the turtle soup. The doctor's hands had developed the characteristic tremor of advanced arsenic poisoning, and his mental faculties were becoming increasingly impaired. Without his testimony about the poison detection, Judge Blackwood's case would rest entirely on circumstantial evidence and suspicion. The final blow to the investigation came at 11:30 that night, when a Union artillery shell scored a direct hit on the eastern wing of Balfour House. The explosion destroyed Dr. Balfour's study, incinerating his medical books, his chemical testing equipment, and most importantly, the physical evidence he had collected from the contaminated dishes, the turtle soup tureen, the wine glasses, the serving utensils that might have retained traces of arsenic. All of it was reduced to smoking rubble. Maria watched the flames consume the evidence of her crime from the kitchen window, feeling a mixture of relief and bitter irony. The same war that had interrupted her perfect murder was now protecting her from its consequences. The Union forces that represented a potential path to freedom were also destroying the proof that could have led to her execution. Judge Blackwood found himself in an impossible position. His primary witness was dying of the same poison that had killed the victims. His physical evidence had been destroyed by enemy artillery. His circumstantial case, while compelling, wasn't strong enough to justify executing a valuable piece of property, which is how the law viewed Maria without absolute certainty of guilt. The decision was made easier by military necessity. Vicksburg was under siege, and every able-bodied person was needed for the city's defense. The enslaved population, in particular, was crucial for maintaining supply lines, building fortifications, and keeping the Confederate war effort functioning. Executing Maria, based on suspicion alone, would serve no practical purpose and would deprive the city of a skilled cook during a time when food preparation was becoming increasingly critical. On December 26th, Judge Blackwood officially closed his investigation with a finding of death by unknown causes, possibly related to tainted food supplies due to wartime conditions. It was a face-saving conclusion that avoided admitting that someone had successfully poisoned half of Vicksburg's leadership, while suggesting that the deaths might have been accidental rather than deliberate. Maria remained in the Balfour household, continuing to cook for the surviving family members and serving the Confederate officers who had taken over the house as a temporary headquarters. To outside observers, she appeared to be the same loyal servant she had always been, grieving appropriately for her deceased employers while adapting to the new realities of life in a besieged city. But privately, Maria grappled with the complex legacy of her actions. She had achieved a kind of victory. Several of the people responsible for her son's sale were dead, and the Confederate power structure in Vicksburg had been severely weakened. Yet the cost had been higher than she had anticipated, claiming victims who had played no direct role in her family's destruction. The Union siege of Vicksburg would continue for months, ultimately ending in Confederate surrender on July 4, 1863. Maria would live to see that surrender and the freedom it brought to Vicksburg's enslaved population. But she would also carry the secret of what she had done on Christmas Eve, 1862, for the rest of her life, a secret that died with her in 1897. The story of Maria's Christmas Eve conspiracy survived only in whispered conversations among the families who had been present that night, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers of slavery's brutal system. Some versions painted her as a monster who had poisoned innocent people. Others portrayed her as a freedom fighter who had struck back against her oppressors with whatever weapons were available to her. The truth, as often happens with history's most compelling mysteries, probably lies somewhere between those extremes. Maria was neither pure victim nor simple villain, but a human being pushed to desperate measures by an inhumane system that left her no legal recourse for the destruction of her family. Her story reminds us that the real horror of slavery wasn't just the obvious cruelties, but the way it created conditions where such acts of desperate vengeance became inevitable. In the end, perhaps the most haunting aspect of Maria's story isn't what she did, but what drove her to do it, and how many other similar stories were buried by the chaos of war, leaving us to wonder how many other Christmas dinners in the antebellum South carried secrets that died with their participants. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.